Imagine waking up one day and realizing no one would notice if you vanished, not because you're invisible, but because you've quietly trained the world to look past you. What if the absence of friends isn't a failure, but a signal? You wake before the alarm. The room is silent in a way that feels intentional, as if the world has decided to hold its breath without you. Your phone lies face down. No notifications. No unfinished conversations tugging at your attention. For a moment, there is peace. Then comes the question you keep outrunning. When was the last time someone truly knew me, and stayed? People assume that those without friends are broken in obvious ways. Awkward. Cold. Unlikable. However, that assumption is comforting because it lets everyone else feel secure. If loneliness were loud and clumsy, it would be easy to spot. Easy to avoid. Yet the most isolated people often appear composed, insightful, even intimidatingly self-sufficient. They don't beg for attention. They don't collapse in public. They carry their solitude like a private language. Here's the paradox that no one tells you. The traits that make you deeply thoughtful, perceptive, and emotionally independent are often the same traits that quietly exile you. You notice patterns others miss. You hear what's not being said. Conversations feel shallow, not because you're arrogant, but because your mind refuses to skim the surface of things that matter. You sense the emotional temperature of a room within seconds. And because you sense it, you adjust. You adapt. You withhold. You become easy to be around, so easy that no one ever asks what it costs you. Have you ever felt exhausted after socializing, not because people drained you, but because you were performing a version of yourself small enough to fit the room? Have you ever pulled away from others, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because you saw where the connection was going, and you knew it would never reach the depth you needed? This is where the contradiction sharpens. The very awareness that protects you also isolates you. You tell yourself you don't need many people. That quality matters more than quantity. That independence is strength. And all of that is true. But it's not the whole truth. Because somewhere along the way, discernment hardens into distance. Self-respect turns into emotional minimalism. And without ever making a dramatic decision, you find yourself alone, not abandoned, but unapproached. Here's a question that lingers uncomfortably long. What if people aren't avoiding you, but assuming you don't want them? Think about how you move through the world. You don't overshare. You don't chase validation. You rarely complain. You've learned to process pain internally, efficiently, almost elegantly. To others, this reads as strength. Composure. Mystery. But mystery doesn't invite connection, it intimidates it. So people keep their distance, believing they're respecting your boundaries, when in reality, they're responding to an invisible wall you never meant to build. And the most unsettling part? You may have built it to survive. At some point in your life, closeness cost you something. Trust was mishandled. Vulnerability was punished. Or maybe you simply learned early that relying on yourself was safer than hoping someone else would show up. So you refined the skill of emotional self-sufficiency until it became second nature. Admirable. Effective. Lonely. This is the curiosity cliff most people never reach. What if having no friends isn't about rejection, but about protection taken too far? Because protection, when left unquestioned, becomes a prison with invisible bars. You don't feel trapped. You feel in control. And that's why the pattern persists. There's no dramatic pain to force change, just a low, persistent absence. A quiet knowing that something human is missing, even as your life appears functional, even impressive. But before you rush to fix anything, pause here. Because the reason this pattern exists is far deeper than social skills or personality types. It's rooted in how your mind learned to stay safe, how meaning formed around independence, and how modern society quietly rewards emotional distance while pretending to celebrate connection. And once you see the real source of this isolation, you won't be able to unsee it. If you want the full truth, hit like so. This story reaches more people. The silence you live inside didn't appear overnight. It formed slowly, almost intelligently, shaped by forces far older than your personal story. And here is the uncomfortable payoff to the question we left open. Yes, this isolation began as protection. But protection from what, exactly? To understand that, you have to look beneath behavior and into meaning. The human psyche does not fear loneliness first. It fears insignificance. According to Carl Jung, loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. That single sentence explains more than years of social advice ever could. You didn't lose friends because you lack warmth. You lost resonance. Somewhere along the way, you realized that what mattered to you, your questions, doubts, values, contradictions, didn't land. Not because others were cruel, but because most people live at a different psychological altitude. And rather than translate yourself endlessly, you chose silence. This is where the first hidden force emerges: depth mismatch. People with heightened introspection often experience what psychologists call asymmetric disclosure. You listen deeply, understand quickly, and see through masks early. But you reveal little. Not because you're secretive, but because revealing too much too soon has taught you a brutal lesson. Most people don't know what to do with depth. They trivialize it, joke past it, or turn away. So your mind adapts. Here, philosophy sharpens the blade. Friedrich Nietzsche warned, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." When you've gazed long into emotional complexity, your own or others, you stop craving crowds. You crave coherence. But coherence is rare. Society quietly reinforces this withdrawal. Modern culture rewards productivity over presence, independence over intimacy, and composure over authenticity. You're praised for being low maintenance, chill, self-sufficient. No one notices that these compliments are the psychological equivalent of being told, "You don't require care." That message sinks deep. Existentialists understood this trap long before social media did. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "If you are lonely when you're alone, you are in bad company." It sounds empowering, until you realize how easily it becomes an excuse to never let anyone close enough to disappoint you. And then there's meaning. Viktor Frankl observed, "When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure." You did the opposite. You chose meaning over distraction, depth over noise. But meaning without shared witness slowly becomes isolation disguised as dignity. Here's the loop we must close. You didn't end up friendless because you failed socially. You optimized psychologically, for safety, clarity, and self-containment. And that optimization worked, until it didn't. Because what the psyche gains in protection, it loses in mirroring. Without others to reflect on yourself, identity becomes brittle. You grow, but in silence. You heal, but unconfirmed. You survive, but unseen. And that leads to consequences most people never consciously connect to friendship at all. Comment one word if you believe this pattern deserves to be exposed. Here is the payoff to the question we left hanging: what happens when protection becomes permanent? At first, nothing dramatic. That's why it's so dangerous. The consequences don't arrive as breakdowns or panic. They arrive as subtle distortions, changes so gradual you mistake them for maturity. You become calmer, but also harder to move. More discerning, but less surprised. Less reactive, and slowly, less reachable. One of the first unseen consequences is emotional compression. When you don't regularly externalize your inner world, when there's no trusted space to think out loud, your emotions begin to fold inward. Neuroscience shows that unshared emotional processing increases cognitive load. The brain spends more energy regulating itself than exploring or connecting. You don't feel sad. You feel muted. Life loses contrast. Then comes the second distortion, hyperautonomy bias. Because you've learned to solve everything alone, your brain starts overestimating self-reliance and underestimating relational value. Psychologists call this a form of learned independence, but philosophically it's closer to what Arthur Schopenhauer meant when he said, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone." It sounds noble, until solitude stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. You stop reaching out not because you don't want connection, but because your nervous system associates closeness with effort, misunderstanding, or disappointment. The reward circuitry adapts. Your brain literally stops expecting emotional payoff from people. This is where cognitive bias locks the pattern in place. Confirmation bias whispers, "See? You're better off alone." Availability bias reminds you only of past disconnections, not future possibilities. And emotional forecasting errors convince you that new relationships will feel exactly like old ones. Slowly, your world shrinks, not externally, but internally. Another consequence is identity drift. Humans don't fully know themselves in isolation. We refine our values, humor, boundaries, and even beliefs through relational friction. Without that friction, identity becomes self-referential. You think you know who you are, but parts of you remain unactivated, undeveloped, waiting for the right context that never arrives. And perhaps the most painful consequence, invisible grief. You grieve friendships that never existed. Conversations that could have happened. Versions of yourself that only emerge when witnessed. This grief has no ritual, no language, no social permission. So it turns inward and disguises itself as detachment. People may describe you as private, reserved, or hard to read. They don't see the truth. You are highly readable, to yourself. You feel everything. You simply stopped expecting anyone else to hold it with you. This is the trap completed. You become emotionally self-sustaining, cognitively sharp, outwardly composed, yet quietly starved of resonance. And because there is no obvious pain, there is no urgency to change. The system stabilizes. But stability is not fulfillment. And now that you can see the consequences clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. What would it actually take to break this pattern, without betraying who you are? Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. Breaking free does not mean becoming more social. That belief is the final lie the pattern tells you. If you try to fix this by forcing small talk, expanding your circle, or performing openness, you will fail, and worse, you will confirm your suspicion that connection was never meant for you. The rebellion begins somewhere far quieter, and far more dangerous to the old system. It begins with selective vulnerability. Not vulnerability as exposure. Vulnerability as precision. The mistake you've been making is not distance, it's withholding until certainty. You wait until someone proves they can understand you before you reveal yourself. But proof only emerges after revelation. This creates a closed loop that no one else can enter. History is filled with people who broke similar patterns, not by lowering their standards, but by changing their sequence. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality." Notice what he did not say. He did not say safety comes first. He said love does, and love always risks being misunderstood. The rebellion, then, is this: you offer a measured truth before trust is complete. Not everything. Not your deepest wounds. But something real enough to disrupt the polished self-sufficiency people have come to expect from you. When you do this, something counterintuitive happens. Others relax. They stop performing around you. They meet you where you are, instead of where they assumed you lived. The second act of rebellion is renouncing emotional minimalism. You've trained yourself to need very little from others. It feels powerful. But power without permeability becomes isolation. Rebellion means allowing yourself to want, without immediately rationalizing the desire away. Philosophically, this echoes Jean-Paul Sartre's insight that we are condemned to be free. Freedom includes the freedom to need, to reach, to risk being shaped by another's presence. And the third, most radical shift, stops signaling invulnerability. You don't do this with words. You do it with energy. Your calm. Your competence. Your emotional control. These are admirable, but they tell others, I don't require you. Humans bond through usefulness to one another. When there is no perceived role, there is no entry point. So the rebellion is to let someone matter. Ask for input you don't strictly need. Share uncertainty instead of conclusions. Allow silence to be shared, not managed. These small fractures in your armor are not weaknesses, they are invitations. Here's the loop we close. Connection was never blocked because you were too different. It was blocked because you were too complete too early. And now the final question opens. If connection requires risk, and risk reshapes identity, who might you become if you let yourself be changed? Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. Here is the final payoff, the truth that reframes everything that came before. The deepest reason people without friends stay alone is not fear of rejection. It is the fear of transformation. Because a real connection does not simply add comfort to your life. It reorganizes you. It disrupts your internal equilibrium. It exposes blind spots your solitude has carefully protected. And if your identity was built around self-sufficiency, depth, and internal coherence, then intimacy feels like a threat to the very architecture of who you are. This is the realization most people never reach. Loneliness persists not because you are unwanted, but because your current self cannot survive the kind of closeness you secretly crave. Philosophically, this is the final paradox. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." You've been hearing a different music your entire life. Depth, meaning, psychological truth. But dancing alone eventually becomes exhausting, not because the music stops, but because movement without witness loses momentum. Here is the ultimate truth, stated plainly. You didn't become isolated because you lacked social ability. You became isolated because you outgrew your old emotional structures, and never replaced them with shared ones. So you stabilized instead. You became internally consistent. Quietly impressive. Safe. But safety is not the same as aliveness. Carl Jung warned, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What he didn't add, but implied, is that you cannot become who you truly are alone. Parts of you only emerge in response to another consciousness. Certain courage, humor, tenderness, and even strength remain dormant without a relationship as the catalyst. This is the final loop closure. You were never meant to abandon your depth to gain connection. You were meant to risk your depth to complete it. And here is the most powerful shift of all. Stop asking, "Why don't I have friends?" Start asking, "What version of me is required for real connection, and am I willing to let go of the current one?" Because the moment you allow yourself to be changed, not fixed, not diluted, but expanded, the pattern breaks. Not instantly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. You don't need many people. You need one honest rupture in the illusion of total self-sufficiency. And once that happens, loneliness stops being your identity and becomes what it always was: a transition. If this shocked you, comment truth below. Like if this articulated something you've never been able to name. Comment, what trait in this story felt uncomfortably accurate? Subscribe if you want psychology and philosophy that doesn't lie to you to make you feel better, but tells the truth so you can become free.